My name is Amelia, and if someone had asked me 6 months ago how I saw my life, I would have said it was calm and predictable. I worked at an advertising agency in the heart of a bustling metropolis, and in the evenings I would return home to Jacob, my boyfriend, with whom I had been sharing an apartment for several years. Our life was orderly and served dinners and cozy restaurants, watching TV shows on the couch and making plans for the future, which we discussed at the end of each week. But there was something that slowly and imperceptibly began to erode this idyll. Perhaps it was the monotony that I had grown tired of, or the fact that our conversations increasingly turned into exchanges of routine phrases. It felt like we were playing roles in a play with a plot that had long been known. Jacob didn't notice this, immersed in his work and hobbies, but I felt an invisible wall growing between us. I was missing something, but I couldn't figure out what it was. One day, on an ordinary day, as I was returning home from work, I noticed a new tenant moving into the neighboring apartment, Oscar. I learned his name when we bumped into each other in the elevator. Tall, with a confident stride and a barely perceptible smile on his lips, he looked at me as if he could see right through me. I didn't give it much thought. We exchanged a few polite phrases, and I hurried home to my familiar cozy routine. But that evening, I couldn't shake the strange feeling I had when I was around him. The next day, as I passed by his door, I felt a slight unease. It was as if something inside me wanted to meet his gaze again, to hear his voice once more. It was something I didn't quite understand. Perhaps just curiosity, perhaps something more. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Even in Jacob's presence, as we sat on the couch watching another series, I found myself mentally returning to that brief moment in the elevator. My life with Jacob was stable, but not alive. It was as if we were stuck in the same scene, repeating the same lines. And Oscar, he seemed so fresh, new, like a breath of air in a stuffy room. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't help my thoughts. They kept drifting back to him, no matter how hard I tried to distract them. Several weeks passed. Jacob and I continued living together, but I felt that something had changed. A cold distance had grown in our relationship that I couldn't bridge. Perhaps he had started to suspect something too, but we both preferred to remain silent, pretending everything was as it had always been. But I knew it wasn't. Meanwhile, Oscar had become a part of my daily existence. We met by chance in the parking lot, in the entrance in the elevator. Sometimes we exchanged short conversations that left me with a strange sense of excitement. I began to realize that these fleeting encounters filled me with something I had been missing so much. Vitality, emotions, something that had long disappeared from my life with Jacob. And then one day, after a long day at work, I met Oscar in the elevator again. He was calm and confident, as always, but there was something new in his gaze that made me freeze for a moment. We just looked at each other, and I felt something inside me turn upside down. It was a moment that couldn't be ignored. But I didn't know what to do. My heart raced, and I couldn't look away. The elevator doors opened, and we went our separate ways to our apartments. But that brief instant, that exchange of glances, left me alone with my feelings, which began to surface. I realized that my life would never be the same again. Something had started to change inside me, and I couldn't stop it. When I walked into the apartment, Jacob was already home. He was, as usual, sitting at the table, engrossed in his work. I tried to force myself back into the familiar rhythm, but thoughts of Oscar kept coming back. Like a ghost I couldn't banish, I felt the chasm between Jacob and me growing, and the thought weighed heavily on me. A few weeks had passed since I first met Oscar in the elevator, but my thoughts about him had become more obsessive. It seemed as though his presence followed me like a shadow, intertwining with my daily routine. At first, it seemed like mere coincidence, but soon I realized that I was anticipating these encounters like a breath of fresh air. Jacob and I continued to live together, but the distance between us was becoming more noticeable. I tried not to think about what was happening and just moved through life on autopilot. Our conversations had dwindled to discussions of mundane details, weekend plans, and work. Jacob increasingly stayed late at work while I delved deeper into my thoughts. Oscar, on the other hand, was everywhere. Our chance meetings had almost become a ritual. Brief conversations by the elevator, exchanges of greetings at the entrance, rare glances that seemed to convey more than words. Every time I saw him, something inside me responded as if someone was lighting a fire I had been trying to extinguish for so long. One evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. It was a warm spring evening and the air was filled with freshness. As I strolled down the street enjoying the calm, I unexpectedly ran into Oscar. He was sitting on a bench in a small park near our home, reading a book. When he looked up and saw me, his face lit up with a smile. "Amelia," he said with a slight tone of surprise in his voice, "how nice to run into you. Here, sit down if you don't mind." I couldn't resist his offer and sat down beside him. We began to talk, and I felt the ease of his conversation style draw me in. He spoke about the book he was reading, about how he had moved into our building, and about his hobbies. I listened to him with interest, amazed at how effortlessly and naturally our conversation flowed. We didn't notice how time flew by. It was already dusk when I realized it was time to head home. I stood up to say goodbye, but at that moment something unexpected happened. When I extended my hand to say farewell, Oscar took it, and suddenly our eyes met again. Time seemed to stand still. Everything around us faded away, leaving us alone with our emotions. And then, before I had time to comprehend what was happening, I felt his lips touch mine. It was a brief, fleeting kiss, almost accidental, yet filled with such deep emotion that it made my head spin. We both froze, realizing what had just happened. But neither of us made any attempt to pull away. That moment was like a flash tearing through the darkness of my monotonous existence. I felt something awakening inside me, as if I had just crossed an invisible boundary, and now there was no turning back. We both remained silent, understanding that this accidental kiss had changed everything. I returned home feeling confused and unsettled. Jacob, as usual, was sitting at his computer, absorbed in some project. He didn't even notice when I came in. I went into the bedroom, feeling the adrenaline coursing through my veins, and the thoughts of the kiss with Oscar wouldn't leave my mind. I tried to calm down, convincing myself that it was just a fleeting moment of weakness, a meaningless incident, but even lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling. Oscar stayed in my thoughts, and I knew that this was something more than just a chance encounter. Something about this man had awakened emotions in me that I had long buried under layers of routine. I tried to ignore it, but I understood that with each passing moment, it was becoming harder to do so. The next day, I met Oscar again. He was as calm and confident as always. We exchanged smiles and brief greetings, but in his eyes, I noticed something new that made me pause. It was like an unspoken acknowledgement, a silent agreement about what had happened between us the day before. No words were needed. Everything had been said without them. From that moment on, every time I saw him, I felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement. I knew it was wrong, that I was playing with fire that could consume me completely, but I couldn't stop. It was as if I was standing on the edge of a precipice, balancing on the brink, unable to decide whether to step forward or retreat. My life with Jacob continued, but it no longer felt peaceful. Now I saw an emptiness in it that I hadn't noticed. Before, I felt that my chance encounters with Oscar were filling that void, that his presence was becoming something essential to me, like air. Each day I became more convinced that this wasn't just a passing infatuation. It was something more, something I could no longer ignore. But I knew that difficult decisions awaited me, and that this path could lead to the destruction of everything I once considered unshakable. Several weeks had passed since that moment when Oscar and I crossed paths in the park, and I realized that our connection was no accident. Our encounters became more frequent and our conversations more candid. While Jacob became increasingly absorbed in his work and immersed in his routine, I found myself sinking deeper into the world Oscar was creating for me. One evening, when Jacob was away on yet another business trip, Oscar suggested we spend the weekend together out of town. I hesitated for a long time, but giving in to an inner impulse, I agreed. We went to a small cottage by a lake, surrounded by dense forest, where time seemed to stand still. There was no hustle and bustle of the city here, and I felt the weight of the past few months beginning to lift off my shoulders. In the evening, as the sun was setting behind the horizon, painting the sky in warm hues, we sat on the veranda enjoying the silence. Oscar told stories about his travels, and as I listened to him, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what I had been missing: freedom, freshness, a new perspective on life. His voice was soft, almost soothing. And I realized that I hadn't felt so relaxed in a long time. It was at that moment that I felt something changing between us. Oscar fell silent, and for a few seconds, there was silence. I noticed how he was looking at me. There was something more than just friendly affection in his gaze. That feeling I had been trying to suppress since the beginning of our acquaintance flared up inside me again. He leaned in closer, and before I could comprehend what was happening, our lips met again. But this time, the kiss was long, deliberate, full of emotions that we could no longer hide. It was like a flash that illuminated my inner world, shattering all the walls I had built around myself. That moment, filled with passion and mutual attraction, made me forget everything about Jacob, about our relationship, about the past. All that existed in that moment was Oscar and me, and I could no longer deny that something deeper was igniting between us. The kiss ended, but its echo remained with me, filling my soul. We continued the evening as if nothing had happened, but the tension between us only grew. I felt two forces battling within me. One screamed that this was wrong, that I was betraying everything I had with Jacob, while the other told me that for the first time in a long time, I felt truly alive. Oscar didn't mention what had happened again, but his eyes revealed everything: desire, determination, and a readiness to go all the way. When we returned to the city, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. Jacob, of course, noticed the changes in me. He began asking questions, trying to understand what was happening. I saw his confusion, felt his pain, but I couldn't find the strength to confess to him what had already occurred. We started arguing more frequently, and one evening, after yet another outburst of anger, I couldn't hold back any longer and told him the truth. That scene will remain etched in my memory forever. Jacob sat across from me, his face twisted in pain and disappointment. I watched him struggle to comprehend what he had just heard, but it was too much. He looked at me as if he were seeing the real me for the first time, and I felt everything we had built over the years crumbling between us. I tried to explain, but words couldn't convey the complexity of my emotions. "I love you, Amelia," he said, looking me in the eye. "But I can't live with this. I can't go on, knowing you're no longer with me." His words cut through me like a knife. I knew he was right. I could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. Jacob asked me to leave, and despite the weight of that decision, I knew there was no other way. That same evening, I packed my things and left. I went to Oscar, hoping that a new life with him would be better, that I could forget what I had destroyed. The first days with Oscar were filled with passion and euphoria, as if the whole world had suddenly opened up to me in a new light. We spent time together, enjoying every moment. He introduced me to places I had never known before, opened new horizons, and gave me the sense of freedom I had been searching for. Initially, it seemed like the perfect life, the awakening I had so desperately needed. But soon as the initial wave of excitement began to subside, I started noticing cracks in our new world. The confidence that Oscar once exuded began to morph into control, and the freedom he had promised became nothing more than an illusion. One day, after returning home from a meeting with a friend, I was confronted by his jealousy. He started asking questions that sounded more like accusations, and I detected a note of suspicion in his voice. I tried to explain that it was just a friendly meeting, but he didn't listen. Our arguments became more frequent, and each time I felt the spark that had once drawn me to him beginning to fade. He wanted to know where I had been, who I had met, and why I had come home so late. At first, I tried to justify myself, but soon realized that each answer only fueled his distrust. He started checking my phone, following my every move, and even a meeting with colleagues from work became a new source of conflict. I realized that this was not the life I had envisioned. I began to feel trapped. I had left everything behind for this man, and now I understood that I had made a terrible mistake. Oscar was no longer the person who had given me freedom and a sense of a new beginning. He had become someone who was destroying me from the inside, taking away even the small piece of peace I had left. When I tried to talk to him about it, he became increasingly aggressive. One evening, after yet another outburst of anger, I realized that I could no longer live like this. I thought of Jacob, his calmness, his steadiness, and realized that I had destroyed something truly valuable. For the first time in a long time, I felt the sharp pain of loss. I tried to contact Jacob, hoping for at least a brief conversation, but he didn't respond. Soon I found out that he had started a new life, one that no longer had room for me. This realization hit me like a cold shower, washing away all illusions at once. I was left alone in an empty apartment, surrounded only by memories of what I had lost. Those nights I couldn't sleep, lying in bed and reflecting on what had led me to this moment. Oscar, who once seemed to embody freedom and passion, had now become a symbol of destruction for me. I realized that my attempts to find happiness and break free from routine had ended in complete failure. The inner world I had hoped to find with him had crumbled, leaving me in a void. The next day, I made a decision that might have been the hardest of my life. I realized that I had to leave. This wasn't an escape from the problem. It was the understanding that I needed to rebuild my life, but this time without destroying everything around me. I packed my things and, without saying a word to Oscar, left the apartment that now felt foreign and hostile. I stepped outside and the cold autumn wind blew around me, a reminder that I was alone. Once again, I didn't know where to go or what to do next. All I had was the realization that I could no longer live as I had before. At first, I found temporary refuge with an old friend. We hadn't been in touch for a long time, but she welcomed me without asking too many questions. I spent several weeks in her small apartment trying to figure out what to do next. I realized that I had destroyed not only my relationships, but also myself, my identity. I no longer knew who I was or what I wanted. Over time, I began to slowly rebuild my life. I found a new job, rented a small apartment, and tried to forget everything that had happened. But the path was long and painful. Every day I felt the past pulling me back, preventing me from moving forward. Months passed, and I started to understand that I would never fully return to what was before. Life with Oscar and the break with Jacob had left an indelible mark on my soul. I had become a different person, but it didn't bring me the satisfaction I had expected. There remained a void inside me that couldn't be filled by work or new acquaintances. I realized that seeking happiness in others was not what would lead me to true peace. I had to find it within myself, but the path to that was long and difficult. I continued to live, but every morning I woke up with the feeling that I wasn't in the right place, and perhaps this search would continue for the rest of my life. But one thing I knew for sure, I would never again allow myself to destroy what was truly important. I had learned the price of my mistakes, and that price was too high. Now I had to live with these memories and learn from them, trying to build a new life that wouldn't be based on illusions and self-deception.